Clara had always believed life was too short to be tied down, too unpredictable to settle into rules that felt suffocating, and tonight, at her friend's cozy little apartment filled with laughter, music, and the aroma of freshly baked bread, she felt that belief stronger than ever. She leaned back in her chair, glass of wine in hand, listening to the chatter around her, friends sharing stories of dates, heartbreaks, and romantic mishaps, and with a playful smirk she found herself declaring loudly, "Only insecure men want monogamy," feeling the thrill of saying something shocking, something bold, because Clara loved the freedom of stirring the pot, loved the little spark of chaos that came when people debated her, and her friends all laughed, some raising eyebrows, some shaking their heads, but no one dared to challenge her too seriously because they knew she thrived on confidence and charm, a woman who could walk into any room and command attention without meaning to, a woman whose laughter was contagious and whose words often carried, feeling that perhaps she had stirred something unknowingly, perhaps she had spoken too loudly, too carelessly, and that there was a subtle shift in their friendship that she hadn't expected, a weight beneath the laughter, a gravity in his quiet presence that contrasted sharply with her usual lightness. In the days that followed, Clara continued with her life as usual, meeting friends for brunch, working late nights at her job, going to art exhibits and small music gigs, living freely and enjoying every moment, but there was always that shadow in her mind, a question she didn't dare voice. Had she underestimated Leo? Had she overlooked the depth of his feelings? Had her words carried more consequence than she imagined? And she found herself recalling small moments, the way he had laughed at her jokes before, the way he had listened intently when she shared stories, the way he had been quietly supportive in ways that were never flashy but always meaningful, and she felt an odd pang in her chest, a mixture of nostalgia and unacknowledged longing, and she tried to dismiss it, telling herself she was fine, telling herself that she was above attachment, telling herself that life was too short to care too deeply, yet her mind kept circling back, wondering if her bravado had been a shield, a mask to protect herself from acknowledging something real and tender that she had never allowed herself to name. Then, one afternoon, a message came through from a mutual friend, casual and offhand, mentioning that Leo had been spending time with someone else, going on dinners, laughing with a new companion, and at first Clara laughed aloud, a hollow sound that she tried to convince herself was amusement and nothing more. But as the details unfolded, the laughter faded, replaced by a strange, unaccustomed ache, a flutter of discomfort that she hadn't anticipated, and she felt her hands tremble slightly, her breath catching, because part of her didn't want to admit it. Part of her wanted to remain invincible, untouchable, unshaken, yet there it was, undeniable, that sharp, unfamiliar twist of emotion that she hadn't foreseen when she had declared monogamy for the week, when she had laughed at the very idea, when she had thought herself untouchable in her freedom. She tried to continue with her routines, walking in the park, grabbing coffee at her favorite cafe, throwing herself into her work with renewed energy, meeting friends for movies, yet everywhere she looked, the reminders of Leo's absence, of his presence with someone new, gnawed at her, a soft but persistent tug on her heart, and she realized that for the first time, her careless words, her bold statements, had collided with reality, with a truth she hadn't accounted for, a truth that emotions are rarely controlled by logic, by bravado, by clever quips at dinner parties, a truth that sometimes, the heart has its own plan, and it doesn't always respect freedom, independence, or declarations of invincibility. As Clara sat alone in her apartment one evening, the city lights flickering through her window, the hum of life outside, she reflected on all the moments she had taken for granted, all the times she had assumed she could remain untethered without consequence, and she felt a deep, quiet awareness settling in her chest, a mixture of longing and regret, not bitter, not angry, but a soft, aching curiosity about what might have been, about the tenderness she had overlooked in her dismissal, about the warmth she had ignored in her insistence on freedom, and she realized that the universe had a way of teaching lessons gently, sometimes painfully, and that maybe, just maybe, this was her lesson, the first real encounter with the consequences of her own words, the first true recognition that hearts are fragile, complicated, and capable of surprising twists, and she knew, without fully admitting it, that the story was far from over, that something had shifted in the space between her and Leo, that her bold declaration had set events in motion, that the game she thought she was controlling was already changing in ways she hadn't foreseen, and she felt a thrill mingled with apprehension, a whisper of anticipation alongside the ache in her chest, because for all her insistence on freedom, she realized that freedom could be complicated, messy, and unexpectedly emotional, and as she poured herself another glass of wine, watching the city shimmer in the night, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next, whether she would remain untouchable, or whether the quiet, steady presence of someone who had always cared might find its way back into her life, and in that thought, both terrifying and exciting, Clara felt the first true stirrings of a lesson that she would carry with her for a long time, that words have weight, hearts have their own will, and sometimes, even when we think we are untethered, life has a way of reminding us that connection, longing, and unexpected emotion are more powerful than any joke, any declaration, any daring claim made in a moment of laughter, and as she finally set her glass down, staring at the night sky, Clara felt something shift inside her, an unfamiliar softness mingling with the thrill of her independence, and she realized, with a quiet, nervous anticipation, that the story of her life and of her heart was only beginning, and that tomorrow, and the day after, and the weeks ahead, would carry surprises she had never imagined, feelings she had never named, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to understand what it truly meant to feel deeply, to care, and to be touched in ways she hadn't allowed herself to be before. After the news about Leo seeing someone else reached Clara, her days became a swirl of emotions she wasn't prepared for, each morning waking with a fluttering anxiety she tried to ignore, telling herself she was above jealousy, above attachment, above letting another person's choices affect her, but the truth was stubborn and insistent, curling in her chest like a quiet storm she could not shake. At work, she found herself distracted, staring at her computer screen as her mind replayed memories of Leo, the way he laughed at her dry humor, the small gestures he made that always went unnoticed by everyone else, the way his eyes seemed to understand her without needing words, and she realized how deeply she had taken for granted the warmth he brought into her life, the gentle presence that had been constant, like a shadow she hadn't acknowledged until it was no longer solely hers. She tried filling her evenings with friends, dinners, movies, long walks under the city lights, anything to drown the persistent ache, yet everywhere she turned, reminders appeared, small coincidences that felt like fate taunting her. The familiar cafe where they had once lingered over coffee, the bookstore where he had recommended a novel she secretly loved, the little park bench where they had spent quiet afternoons talking about nothing and everything, and she found herself hesitating. Outside these places, heart fluttering, a strange mix of longing and anxiety, wondering if she could bear to see him with someone else, wondering if she would recognize the man she had always thought she knew. At night, when the city fell silent and she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she found herself imagining him, laughing, talking, sharing moments with this new person, and her chest tightened, a wave of unbidden emotions sweeping through her, not anger, not bitterness, but a tender, aching nostalgia that made her realize how much she had underestimated the bond she had shared with him, how much she had dismissed the importance of his quiet care, and in those moments, she began to see a side of herself she had ignored. The part that had secretly wanted more than freedom, the part that had longed for someone who truly understood her, someone whose presence felt like home, and yet, pride and habit kept her from admitting it, kept her from acknowledging the way her heart quietly ached for him. Even as she laughed at her own vulnerability, she began to notice small changes in her own behavior, the way she lingered on messages from mutual friends, the way she checked social media more than she intended, the way she traced the route he might take on his evenings out, all subtle, almost unconscious, but telling her that she was far more invested emotionally than she wanted to admit, and she hated the admission, hated feeling caught between her previous bravado and the reality of her emotions, yet there was no way to deny it, no way to escape the pull he still had over her heart. One afternoon, she found herself wandering past the little park where they used to meet, seeing children play and couples stroll, and the memory of Leo laughing as a breeze tangled his hair made her stop in her tracks, chest tightening, eyes misting slightly, and she realized she was remembering details she hadn't thought of for months, the curve of his smile, the warmth of his voice, the little habits that had been so ordinary when he was a constant presence in her life but now seemed magical, unattainable, and painfully beautiful. She tried to distract herself with friends, throwing herself into social outings, yet every interaction felt tinged with the memory of him, every laugh had an echo of his voice. Every story she told seemed to lack the weight it had carried when shared with him, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to see a pattern, a truth she had resisted, that her heart had never been as free as she believed, that her laughter at monogamy and bold statements about independence had been shields, clever armor to protect herself from admitting a desire she had never named, and now, faced with the reality of him with someone else, that armor felt thin, fragile, and inadequate, leaving her vulnerable to feelings she could neither command nor suppress. Clara found herself wandering into old haunts, the coffee shop where they shared long conversations, the quiet bookstore where he had recommended poetry she later adored, even the small theater where they had caught a late-night show and debated characters' choices, all places she had once visited casually, now charged with memory, now tinged with longing, and each visit reminded her that she had loved moments more than she realized, that she had cherished Leo's attention and presence even as she told herself she was invincible, untethered, free, and in that realization, a flicker of regret appeared, not loud or demanding, but a soft, persistent ache that reminded her that hearts remember more than minds admit. One rainy evening, as droplets traced delicate paths down her apartment window, she received a casual message from a mutual friend, just a line about Leo attending an art exhibit, and she felt the flutter in her chest, a combination of excitement, dread, and the strange pull of longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel, her mind racing with possibilities, wondering if she should see him, wonder what he looked like with someone new, or if it would crush her to witness laughter she once thought belonged only to her, and she sat quietly with the decision, staring at her reflection in the glass, noticing the tension in her jaw, the quickened heartbeat, and realizing that she was no longer just an observer of her own feelings but a participant in a growing emotional storm, a storm that demanded acknowledgement, understanding, and perhaps, in time, resolution. As days passed, Clara noticed herself imagining conversations with him, rehearsing words she might say, questions she might ask, or confessions she might hide, and she became aware of the subtle ways her heart reacted, quickening at the mention of his name, softening at memories of his laughter, tightening at thoughts of his smile for someone else. And though she tried to occupy her mind with work, art, and friends, those mental wanderings persisted, uninvited but persistent, weaving a delicate, complicated web of longing and self-reflection. She began to see the ways her own pride had protected her, how bravado had kept her from acknowledging the feelings she now felt with such clarity, and she began to wonder if Leo had known all along, if he had seen through her words and laughter, if his quiet, observing presence had always been a mirror to her own heart, a mirror she had refused to look into because it might have revealed desires she wasn't ready to admit, and that thought both thrilled and terrified her, a mix of fear and hope that made her restless at night, imagining what might have been if she had only let herself be vulnerable sooner. Then came the day when she unexpectedly passed him on the street, catching a glimpse of him laughing with someone, the scene brief, fleeting, yet enough to make her heart ache, enough to make her cheeks flush, enough to remind her of the unspoken connection they had shared, and in that instant, a cascade of feelings, longing, regret, admiration, tenderness, flooded her, leaving her breathless, and she realized that despite her insistence on independence, despite her previous dismissals of monogamy and attachment, despite her carefully crafted armor of wit and freedom, her heart had never stopped caring, had never stopped noticing, had never stopped valuing the man who had quietly been a constant in her life. That evening, she wandered through the city, past familiar streets and corners, tracing memories like footprints, imagining laughter she would never hear again in the same way, and she felt a strange, bittersweet joy that came with seeing someone you care about happy, even if happiness no longer included you, a realization both painful and enlightening that love, in its truest form, is not ownership, is not control, is not entitlement, but an appreciation for the connection, however fleeting or redirected, and that sometimes, the deepest emotions are not expressed in declarations or confrontations, but in quiet acknowledgement of feelings too complex for words, too tender for confrontation. As the night deepened, Clara returned to her apartment, sitting by the window and watching the lights of the city shimmer across wet streets, the gentle hum of life outside, the murmur of people living, loving, and making choices she could only observe, and she felt her chest swell with a mix of longing and understanding, a soft ache tempered by clarity, knowing that her life, her choices, her freedom, and her feelings were all interwoven in ways she was only beginning to grasp, and in that quiet moment, she understood that she had been taught a lesson about the unseen pull of connection. The weight of feelings she thought she could avoid, and the quiet, persistent power of someone who had touched her life more profoundly than she had realized. And as she finally lay down to sleep, heart fluttering and mind alive with reflection, Clara felt a subtle shift inside, a soft stirring of awareness that the story between her and Leo was far from over, that the unseen pull was still there, invisible but undeniable, guiding her heart, challenging her bravado, and quietly, insistently reminding her that emotions, once awakened, have a momentum that cannot be stopped, that her independence and freedom had never been opposed to love, but had always been complicated by it, and that in the coming days, weeks, and months, she would need to navigate this delicate, emotional terrain with honesty, courage, and an open heart, for the unseen pull was real, persistent, and quietly demanding her attention. Clara couldn't stop thinking about Leo. Every moment of her day seemed to carry a whisper of him, whether it was the memory of his laugh, the warmth of his presence when he listened without judgment, or the quiet, subtle gestures he had once made that she had dismissed as ordinary but now shone in her memory like small lights guiding her through a fog of longing. And she found herself haunted by the contrast between the man she knew and the person he was becoming in someone else's life, and though she tried to immerse herself in work, in friends, in new experiences, the pull of emotion was persistent, a steady, quiet ache that refused to be ignored, a reminder that her heart was far more invested than her mind had allowed her to admit, and the realization unsettled her, leaving her restless in the nights, pacing her apartment, replaying old conversations in her head, imagining what she might have said, what she might have done differently, how her life could have been altered by just a single choice, a single word, a single moment of vulnerability she had refused to offer. She noticed herself analyzing every interaction they had shared, from small jokes to meaningful talks, wondering if he had known her heart better than she had known it herself, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her, for it meant that the connection they shared was deeper than she had allowed herself to accept, and perhaps, just perhaps, her bravado and dismissive statements about love and monogamy had been a mask, a shield she used to protect herself from acknowledging feelings she wasn't ready to confront. And now, faced with the reality of him seeing someone else, she had no choice but to feel the full weight of her own emotions, a mixture of regret, longing, admiration, and an almost unnameable tenderness that made her heart ache in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every sight of him in her mind, every imagined conversation, made her wonder about the lines they had never crossed, the confessions left unsaid, the delicate moments of shared laughter, the quiet understanding that had been theirs alone, and she realized that love, true love, was not always loud or dramatic but often lived in these understated, intimate details, the moments that seemed small but carried enormous significance, and she began to understand why she felt so unsettled, why even imagining him with someone else brought both pain and fascination, for it revealed to her the depth of her own feelings, the reality that she had been shielding herself from a connection that had always mattered more than she was willing to admit. One evening, driven by a mixture of curiosity and an inexplicable hope, Clara sent a simple message to Leo, a casual, nonchalant text, "Hey, long time no talk," and as soon as she hit send, her chest tightened, breath caught, and 1,000 imagined responses raced through her mind, from polite indifference to enthusiastic warmth, and when his reply arrived, warm, familiar, and gently teasing, she felt a spark of something she hadn't anticipated, a mixture of comfort and longing that reminded her why she had always been drawn to him, why his presence lingered in her thoughts even now, and as they began to exchange messages, short at first, hesitant, testing the waters, she felt a subtle electricity, an emotional tug that pulled her in despite her previous insistence on independence. And with every word, every shared joke, every memory referenced, Clara realized that the connection between them was alive, persistent, and far more complicated than she had allowed herself to believe, challenging the walls she had built around her heart, walls made of pride, bravado, and a misguided sense of invulnerability. She began to notice the little details in his words, the pauses that suggested thoughtfulness, the laughter conveyed through typing, the small glimpses into his daily life that reminded her of the man she had always known. And these details wrapped around her heart like threads, gentle but insistent, and she found herself imagining meeting him in person again, wondering how it would feel to see him smile at her, to hear the warmth in his voice, to experience the closeness that had always been so natural and yet now felt tantalizingly fragile. At the same time, she struggled with her own emotions, the conflict between her desire to maintain her freedom and the undeniable pull of her feelings, the awareness that she cared deeply, and that her heart was capable of being vulnerable even if she hadn't allowed it before. And in this struggle, Clara found herself both exhilarated and afraid, exhilarated by the possibility of renewed connection, afraid of the consequences, the potential heartbreak, the reality that some feelings, once awakened, could not easily be contained. Days turned into weeks as their conversations grew slightly more personal, more revealing, and Clara felt her defenses slowly, almost imperceptibly, melting, replaced by an emotional clarity she hadn't expected. And with this clarity came understanding that her previous dismissals of love and monogamy had been less about principles and more about fear of feeling too much, of depending too much, of losing herself in someone else's world. And now, faced with the reality of Leo's life moving forward with someone else, she understood the truth of her own heart with painful honesty, that love is rarely rational, rarely convenient, rarely neat, but it is persistent, resilient, and capable of creating emotional landscapes that demand attention, reflection, and courage. One afternoon, walking past their favorite cafe, she paused, heart pounding, imagining him sitting there, laughing with someone new, and she felt a wave of longing, sharp and electric, mixed with a tenderness that made her chest ache, and she realized that even in her independence, she had never truly stopped caring, that the connection between them had always been quietly present, quietly powerful, quietly shaping her emotional life in ways she hadn't noticed until now. And the thought left her simultaneously exhilarated and vulnerable, a cocktail of emotion she hadn't anticipated but could no longer deny. She began to reflect on all the moments she had taken for granted, all the times she had brushed off the weight of his attentions, all the small gestures she had ignored, and in that reflection, a quiet regret settled over her, not bitter or angry, but tender, soft, and reflective, teaching her the importance of noticing, appreciating, and valuing the presence of someone who truly understands and cares for you, the subtle magic of emotional connection that is often invisible until it is threatened or seemingly lost. At night, she lay awake thinking about him, wondering what he was doing, imagining the laughter he shared with someone else, and in that imagining, she realized how much she had relied on his presence without acknowledging it, how much she had secretly treasured the comfort, the warmth, the understanding he offered effortlessly. And though part of her wanted to push these thoughts away, to cling to her previous independence, she could not, for the feelings had roots that ran deep and were intertwined with her own sense of identity, her own emotional growth, her own understanding of love, connection, and vulnerability. Clara began to see that the heart is not something to command or control but a living, breathing entity that moves in rhythms often outside of reason, and that her own journey, her own independence, her own boldness, had always been accompanied by an undercurrent of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to explore fully. And now, with Leo partially back in her emotional orbit, she was confronted with the reality of her feelings, and she had to acknowledge them, to understand them, to navigate them, and in doing so, she felt a mixture of fear, excitement, longing, and the thrill of rediscovery, a cocktail of emotion that made her pulse race, her thoughts whirl, and her nights restless yet profoundly alive. She remembered the times they had shared late-night walks, spontaneous conversations about dreams and fears, laughter that carried into the early morning, moments of quiet intimacy that were never physical but always emotionally charged, and she realized that these memories, once dismissed as ordinary, were in fact the foundation of a connection that had shaped her heart and mind in ways she was only now beginning to understand. And the realization made her feel both humbled and deeply aware of the gravity of her own emotions, the beauty of connection, and the inevitability of longing when hearts have touched deeply. Clara's conflicted heart oscillated between hope and hesitation, desire and restraint, the thrill of possibility and the fear of loss, and through it all, she learned the subtle, painful, and beautiful lesson that caring deeply is both a gift and a challenge, that emotions cannot always be tamed or reasoned with, that the heart has a momentum all its own, and that the path to understanding, to emotional clarity, and perhaps to renewed connection, requires courage, patience, and honesty with oneself. And as she sat by the window one night, watching the city shimmer under soft lights, she felt the quiet, insistent pull of her heart. The gentle, unrelenting force of love and longing, and she knew with a tender certainty that whatever happened next, she would be changed, awakened, and more deeply aware of the fragile, complex, and beautiful nature of human emotion. And she felt a flicker of hope, a cautious but real anticipation, that the story between her and Leo was far from over, that the conflicted heart was still learning, still discovering, still capable of growth, still capable of being touched, and that in embracing her feelings, she might finally understand what it meant to care, to connect, and to love without pretense or fear. Clara had spent weeks navigating the storm of her feelings, moving through restless nights, racing thoughts, and quiet moments of longing, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to notice a shift within herself, a gentle softening of the ache that had consumed her heart, a subtle acceptance that life could continue even as Leo's presence in someone else's life became real and undeniable, and she realized that this acceptance was not the same as indifference, for she still cared deeply, still felt the pull of connection, but it was tempered now by understanding, by the recognition that love was not about possession or control but about appreciation and gratitude for the bond they had shared, the moments they had built together, the laughter, the conversations, the quiet understanding that had always existed between them and that had quietly shaped her own emotional growth. She began to see him in her mind without the sharp pangs of longing, seeing his smile, his thoughtful gestures, the way he carried himself, and feeling warmth rather than pain, a soft glow in her chest that reminded her that her heart was capable of resilience, of letting go without losing the depth of feeling, and she started to understand that true love, true connection, was not always about being together, but about valuing what had existed and allowing it to continue in whatever form life provided, whether near or far, together or apart, and she found herself smiling at memories rather than mourning them, reflecting on moments of joy rather than dwelling on absence. And this realization gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible, a quiet joy that coexisted with the lingering stir of longing, a nuanced, mature understanding of her own heart. As days turned into weeks, Clara found herself more present in her own life, noticing the colors of the city around her, the laughter of children in parks, the gentle hum of cafes and bookstores, and she began to appreciate the richness of her own existence, the beauty in small moments, and the freedom that came with releasing the illusion that control over love was ever possible, that ownership could define connection, or that her value was tied to the choices of another. And in this awareness, she found clarity, a grounding in herself that allowed her to approach emotions with honesty, compassion, and gentleness, seeing the world not as a series of losses or missed opportunities but as a landscape rich with possibility, emotion, and human connection. One quiet evening, she wandered past the art gallery where Leo had recently attended an exhibit, her steps slow and deliberate, heart calm yet aware, and she imagined him inside, appreciating the paintings, sharing his thoughts, smiling, laughing, and instead of jealousy, a soft warmth rose in her chest, a recognition that his happiness did not diminish hers, that love was not a limited resource, and that the depth of feeling she had experienced, the longing, the tender ache, the excitement of connection, had taught her something priceless about herself and about life, and she felt gratitude, a gentle, profound gratitude for having been touched by someone so deeply, for having learned to notice, to care, and to feel fully, without shame, without fear, without pretense, and she understood that this awareness was part of growing emotionally, of living with a heart open enough to love and strong enough to release when necessary. Over the following days, Clara embraced her life with renewed energy, reconnecting with friends, pursuing creative projects, taking spontaneous trips, enjoying music and art, and noticing small joys that had been overlooked in the intensity of her earlier emotions, and she felt her heart expand, holding both memory and presence, longing and acceptance, the past and the present in a delicate, balanced harmony that made her feel alive, aware, and emotionally awake, a state that was both comforting and exhilarating, a testament to her own resilience and capacity for growth, a gentle understanding that life, with all its complexity and unpredictability, carried beauty in every emotion, every connection, and every experience. At night, when the city lights shimmered against her window, Clara often thought of Leo, not with sorrow or regret, but with a soft appreciation, a recognition that the bond they shared had shaped her in ways she could not ignore, that he had helped her learn about love, care, and the courage to feel, and she realized that in releasing control, in allowing both herself and him to live fully, she had discovered a deeper, quieter kind of love, one that existed beyond the need for proximity, possession, or constant affirmation, a love that was mature, patient, and quietly powerful, a love that could coexist with joy, with independence, and with the gentle acceptance of reality. One afternoon, she received a small note from a mutual friend, mentioning Leo's recent travels, and instead of the flutter of anxiety that would have once gripped her, Clara felt a calm curiosity, a soft smile forming on her lips, for she now understood that whatever paths they each took, the connection they had shared remained a part of her, a cherished memory, a tender lesson, and she could honor it without allowing it to dominate her emotions, and she felt a profound sense of empowerment, not in controlling outcomes but in embracing life fully, experiencing love deeply, and understanding that her heart was strong, capable, and endlessly adaptable. As she walked through familiar streets, past cafes, bookstores, and parks, she reflected on the emotional journey she had traveled, the nights of restless longing, the days of subtle ache, the slow awakening to her own feelings, and she understood that this journey had not been in vain, for it had taught her the subtle art of balancing desire with acceptance, longing with understanding, hope with reality, and the intricate dance of emotional maturity. And she recognized that these lessons were not only about Leo or any specific relationship, but about her own capacity to navigate life with an open heart, a clear mind, and a sense of self-awareness that allowed her to appreciate connections deeply while maintaining her own identity and freedom. In quiet moments, she imagined conversations with him, not out of expectation or hope, but as a way to honor the emotional bond that had existed, acknowledging the depth of feeling without needing resolution or reclamation, and she felt a soft serenity, a gentle understanding that love, in its truest form, was not about demands, possession, or outcomes, but about presence, appreciation, and allowing both herself and others to live fully, to grow, and to experience life's beauty without restriction. And this realization brought her an unexpected joy, a freedom that was deeper than any independence she had previously celebrated, a freedom rooted not in detachment but in emotional clarity, compassion, and maturity. Clara began to notice subtle changes in herself. The way she smiled more freely, laughed more easily, and engaged with life with a renewed sense of curiosity and joy, the way she felt comfortable embracing both her emotions and her independence simultaneously. And she realized that the depth of her heart had grown, that the tender ache she had once feared was now a gentle reminder of her capacity to feel, to care, and to love without being overwhelmed, and she felt a sense of pride, not in triumph, but in the quiet, steady resilience of her emotional journey, and she understood that this resilience would guide her through future challenges, relationships, and experiences, allowing her to navigate the complexities of human connection with grace, honesty, and compassion. Over time, Clara found herself enjoying Leo's presence in stories shared by friends, in casual mentions, in glimpses of his life that reached her indirectly, and she felt genuine happiness for him, a warmth that radiated in her chest, a recognition that love and care could exist without direct possession, without constant proximity, and that her own heart could continue to flourish, open to new experiences, new connections, and new joys, while honoring the past, the lessons learned, and the tender, emotional journey that had brought her to this place of understanding, peace, and gentle acceptance. She began to see life as a series of interconnected moments, each with its own beauty, each with its own emotional significance, and she recognized that her journey with Leo, while no longer defined by proximity or romantic expectation, had shaped her profoundly, teaching her the value of patience, awareness, empathy, and emotional courage, and she felt a quiet gratitude for the experience, the memories, and the growth it had inspired, understanding that love was not measured solely by possession or togetherness, but by the depth of feeling, the willingness to understand, and the capacity to honor both connection and independence simultaneously. One evening, walking through the city as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over buildings and streets, Clara felt a profound sense of calm and clarity, her heart light yet aware, filled with the lessons of love, longing, and emotional resilience. and she realized that she was capable of embracing life fully, of caring deeply, and of finding joy in both memory and presence, and she smiled softly, a quiet, radiant acknowledgement that while the story of her connection with Leo had changed, the love she had felt, the lessons she had learned, and the gentle acceptance she now carried were permanent, shaping her into someone stronger, wiser, and more fully alive, ready to move forward with grace, compassion, and an open, resilient heart, capable of loving, living, and embracing the beauty of life in all its complexity, tenderness, and unexpected wonder.